of the divided kingdom. As you will note, there is the same number of kings listed for each, the northern and the southern kingdom, but the period of time covered is quite different. From 922 to 722 is the time of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and from 922 to 587 is the length of time of the southern kingdom. But even though the southern kingdom is about 150 years longer in time, the number of kings is relatively the same, 42, which shows that there was far greater instability in the northern kingdom than there was in the southern kingdom. Last Wednesday evening, we brought the golden age to an end. It had been less than 100 years, just about 70 in fact, that all of those who had come into the promised land had banded themselves together under one leader and had become a kingdom. During the time of the Confederation, they wanted to be a kingdom. They begged Samuel to make them into a kingdom. Samuel pled with them, you don't want to become a kingdom. You want to stay the confederation that you are with the judges that you have. But the people prevailed. Now the argument of Samuel to the people when they wanted a king was simply this. If you're going to get a king, you're going to get taxes, you're going to get regimentation, you're going to get conscription into labor forces and armies. Is that really what you want? Now you're independent. Each of you is a tribe. You make your own rules. You live by your own rules. God is your king. You have no other. But the people prevail. Now, they went into that golden age of 70 years, but the prophecy of Samuel held true. Magnificent strides were made, particularly under Solomon, architecturally. David was the beloved king that solidified all the tribes, reached out and conquered the neighboring Canaanite tribes, the Edomites and the Ammonites, even the Syrians. David had subjected them, and the kingdom had expanded greatly. These are golden years. David wanted to build a temple, but he was dissuaded from that. So it remained just a dream for him. Solomon built the temple. How do you build a temple of the magnitude of the temple that Solomon built? Importing from other countries ivory, cedar, gold, all the magnificence that was that temple. There was only one way to purchase all of this, and that was to get the money from the people. Solomon divided the kingdom up into 12 districts and put a tax collector over each, and they began to collect taxes. That wasn't the only thing. They brought the people together into workforces. One out of every 3 months had to be spent in giving to the workforce of quartering and the various other labor activities that went on in the country. The people began to be a little disillusioned about having a king. They came to realize that there's a lot more exacted of them than they imagined. And so by the time that Solomon came to the end of his reign, there was a lot of grumbling and discontent. And the golden age was coming to an end not only because of Solomon, but because of the discontent of the people and the harshness of a legal society in which they were living. It was the charisma of Solomon, the great wisdom of Solomon, that held them together. But as comes to all men, death came to Solomon. It was roughly 922 BC when Solomon died. When David became king, it was understood that this was the beginning of a dynasty. That the king would take the throne as the proper son of the king who had preceded him. And so it was Rehoboam, son of Solomon, who was to sit upon the throne. Rehoboam was not a David. He wasn't a Solomon. He wasn't a Saul. He was weak, but he was the best that Solomon had to offer. It was easy to be recognized as king at Jerusalem of the tribes of the south. He was of the lineage of David who came from the south. He was a native of the south. But when he went to the northern part of the kingdom to establish his kingship there, he went to Shechem. It was a wise move on his part because Shechem had played a very important part in the history of the people. It was at Shechem that Abraham had built an altar when he came into the promised land. It was at Shechem that the confederation had been established. Jacob had experienced a closeness to God at Shechem. And so in the minds of the people it was a holy place. So Rehoboam came to Shechem thinking that this was the desirable place for him to pronounce his kingship over the northern tribes rather than Jerusalem. Now he was met there by a delegation from the tribes of the north. You see, they were united into one kingdom, but still, by birthright, they were members of tribes, and these were the natural divisions of the people. There were the 10 tribes of the north and the 2 tribes of the south, and representatives of the northern tribes came to Rehoboam. And they said to him, "Your father ruled with a heavy hand. He exacted much promise. He was a cruel taskmaster. Will you relieve the terrible strain that he has imposed upon us? Will you lessen the task that we're required to fulfill?" Rehoboam couldn't give an immediate answer because he wasn't a seasoned king. He wasn't a wise king. In fact, he wasn't very good. So he went to the elders and he counseled with them. And they said, if it were your father Solomon, he would do all that he could to mend the feelings of the people. Go back to them. Promise them that you will study the situation, that you will do everything in your power to lessen the strain that exists. See if you can't get them to support you. Before Rehoboam had an opportunity to carry out what his counselors had advised him to do, he was surrounded by what today we would call young Turks, his contemporaries who were eager and agitating, who saw no need for soothing feelings, but taking a stand. And these would fit well into many of the political situations that have occurred in the past decade or so here. They said to him, "No, don't give in to them on anything. You tell them that if they thought that your father Solomon was a hard taskmaster, just wait until they see what you're capable of doing. Your father held them in line with whips. Tell them you'll hold them in line with scorpions. Show them your heavy hand. Show them your power." Unfortunately, Rehoboam listened to the latter instead of the former, and he went to them and he told them that. Well, down in Egypt, there was a man by the name of Jeroboam just waiting for a time like this. Jeroboam had been one of the taskmasters under Solomon, had fallen into a bad relationship with Solomon, had fled the country for his own safety, had found refuge in Egypt and had been living there. When he learned of what was happening in the north, he immediately came up out of Egypt, came back up into the northern kingdom. There he went to Shechem, and he pronounced himself, with the support of the tribal leaders, as king of the northern tribes. With that, the monarchy was divided. There were 2 kings. One in the southern kingdom, Rehoboam, whose palace was in Jerusalem. There was Jeroboam in the northern kingdom with the site of his government, no palace yet, at Shechem. And so for the next few years, there would be civil wars between these two provinces, the 2 tribes of the south and the 10 tribes of the north. Rehoboam might have had enough power from the empire that he had inherited from his father to overwhelm the northern kingdom and pull them back in, if it hadn't been for the fact that after 3 centuries, Egypt was beginning to stir out of its lethargy. Once again, it was looking at the Fertile Crescent of the land of Canaan, in which it had had such influence over the past centuries, had lost that influence, but now they began to yearn again for the invasion of lands and the regaining of the empire. So they began to creep up into the Fertile Crescent. This was just south of Judah. Rehoboam knew that if he expended all his time and energy fighting his counterpart at the north, that he would be vulnerable to Egypt. And so rather than to do that, he protected himself against Egypt, became vulnerable to the north. And so by the time that he was ready to exercise his political power, it was too late. Jeroboam had already established the dynasty, and they were divided. The northern kingdom now took a name for itself. It would be hereafter known as Eastridge. The southern kingdom would be Judah. From this time on, when we make reference to Judah, we're talking about the southern kingdom. When we talk about Israel, we're talking about the northern kingdom. When we come into the period of the divided kingdom, having left the united kingdom of David and Solomon, we lose hold upon the great kings of Israel. The first 3 were outstanding. Saul, who made such a tremendous contribution, would have made an even greater one if he had not been crippled by Samuel turning against him. Then the coming of David and the coming of Solomon. During these 3 times of strong political leadership, very little attention is given to the prophets. The prophets came into being at the close of the period of the Judges. The Judges had been a combined prophet and political leader. With the coming of the kingdom, the king was a political leader, and there was always a prophet at his side. Solomon had his prophets, David had his prophets, but the prophets were shallow compared to the depth of the kings in their influence and strength. But now we come into a period of the weak kings, of both kingdoms. With the death of Solomon, there won't be another strong, powerful king to come close to what Israel has known. And so there's a long succession of weak kings. Some were assassinated. Some committed suicide. One was king for only 7 days. There was such instability, particularly in the northern kingdom. As you'll note at your leisure later on, that the reigns of the kings in the southern kingdom are much longer than those in the northern kingdom because of the instability there. During the period of the divided kingdom, 3 great prophets arise, and 2 writing prophets appear. The 3 great prophets who appear during this time, whose personalities are so overwhelming that the kings are little thought of, and most attention is paid to the prophets, are the prophet Micaiah, the prophet Elijah, and the prophet Elisha. These 3 prophets are very familiar too because of the outstanding contributions they made during their lifetimes. Now, the prophet Elijah appeared during the time that Ahab was king of the northern kingdom. Very little of note occurred in the northern kingdom except strife, civil battles, until the time of Omri. Omri was a general of the army, and because of the weakness of the dynasty prior to him, because of the many kings that were moving past the throne, the time had come when they needed someone who would step out of succession and just exert strength and power in the kingdom, and Omri was the one to do that. He was commander-in-chief of the armies, and it was a military takeover. Now the writer says of Omri that he was one of the worst influences upon the kingdom. The writer might have been a little prejudiced because he didn't tell us anything about him except 6 verses. And yet history has said that Omri perhaps was the strongest and the wisest and the most able of all the kings since Solomon himself. Interestingly enough, what we know of Omri doesn't come from Scripture but comes from secular history, where his reign has been reflected in the writings of the Assyrians and others who have encountered him. Omri, for a moment, struck a pact with the southern kingdom, and there was a period in which civil strife had gone onto the back burner, and both kingdoms now had strengthened themselves against the surrounding nations. Omri's great note of fame in Scripture is the fact that he gave birth to a son named Ahab. Ahab has been described as the most evil of all the Israelite kings. You see, Omri, in order to strengthen himself, because on the south, Egypt was beginning to stir, on the north, Assyria was beginning to become a contender for world power. There was a period in which the United Kingdom was the great power of the Middle East. Now the other countries were beginning to grow strong, with the northern and the southern kingdoms with internal strife. So Omri has struck a pact with the Phoenicians that they might measure their strength together and have some kind of buffer against any army that might want to attack. Now, in order to solidify the pact that was made, Omri gave his son in marriage to the king of Tyre. Her name was Jezebel. Jezebel appears now in the history of the Israelites as the most infamous woman of all Israelite history. When Ahab brought Jezebel to Samaria, Samaria was now the kingdom, the capital of the kingdom. Omri had moved the capital to Samaria, had built a magnificent city there that rivaled Jerusalem. The reason for that being, he knew that if they were to survive as a kingdom, that they must have some permanence in the capital, such as the southern kingdom had with Jerusalem. As long as Jerusalem showed a permanence and Shechem had no permanence, there would be the implied idea that the northern kingdom would eventually come back into the one kingdom. But with the building of Samaria, the great fortresses there, the beautiful palace, it began to rival Jerusalem as a symbol of permanence in the kingdom. So it was through Samaria that Ahab brought his bride, Jezebel. Well, she was a foreigner, but that's nothing new. Even Solomon had his foreign wives. What the problem was with Jezebel, Ahab brought with Jezebel all of her priests. Astar, which was a fertility goddess, and the god Baal. She had 450 priests of Baal alone, with about 400 priests of Astar. Not only did she bring her priests with her, Ahab built her a temple there in which she could worship Baal. This was an abomination to the people to bring in a temple to worship the gods. So Ahab has been looked upon as the most evil of all the Israelite kings because of his introduction and support of Baal worship in the land of Israel. It was during the time of Ahab, who was really controlled by Jezebel, that the great prophet arose. He is looked upon as the greatest prophet of all Israel. His name is Elijah. He suddenly appears. Nobody knows where he came from. No one knows anything of his lineage. He just suddenly appeared before Ahab, dressed in a leather loincloth with long flowing hair like a wild man. But he came up to Ahab and made this pronouncement: because you have introduced Baal and Ishtar into the land of Israel, God will withhold the rain from the land. It will become parched. There will be no water to drink, to farm by. There won't even be dew. And with that pronouncement of doom, he disappeared just as readily as he had appeared. He left Samaria, where he had confronted Ahab, went into the Jordan Valley, and there he found a place where God had led him, where there was a brook flowing with water, and where the ravens came and brought him bread and meat every morning and every evening. And there, while the world parched about him, he drank and he ate. But eventually the spring itself dried up, and he had to seek another place. And so he went westward until he came to a village in which he found a woman in the city gates, a widow. He was hungry by now, and he said to her, "Fix me some bread to eat." She laughed and said, "You don't know who you approach. I'm the poorest of all. I'm a widow with a son. I have just a little bit of flour in a bin back home, just a little bit of oil in a cruse. And my intention now is to go back home and to bake one final piece of cake with what I have for my son and myself, and then we'll lie down and we'll die of starvation." Elijah said to her, "Take me to your home." And she took him. He said, "Now bake the loaf that you described and bring it to me." And her generosity, even though she and her son were starving, she did as Elijah had told her, gave him what food there was. And he said, "Now because you have provided for my needs, your barrel will never be empty, and your cruse will never be empty at all." And so for 3 years, while the world about them parched from lack of rain, Elijah feasted in the home of the widow and her son. It was here that one of the miracles of the Old Testament took place, when the son died. And Elijah took her upstairs to the room that he occupied in the house. And there, bending 3 times over the young lad and praying, the young man was restored to life, and he was brought back and given to the widow who had taken him into her home. After he had lived there for 3 years, now he went back to Ahab. As he approached, Obadiah of the palace came out, and he knew Elijah. Elijah said to him, "Tell Ahab that I'm here." And Obadiah said, "I'm not going to tell him that you're here. He's so angry because of the curse that you brought upon the land, that he has sent out searchers everywhere to find you, to kill you on sight. I'm not going to go back and tell him that I found you. If he comes and discovers that you're not here, he'll take my life out of his anger." Elijah convinced him to do that, and Obadiah went to Ahab and told him the message that had been given. Ahab came, Elijah confronted him. Elijah said, "Bring to the top of Mount Carmel all of the priests of Baal. I'll meet you there and we'll have a confrontation." Ahab saw that this was an opportunity to be rid of this man who had brought such misfortune to his reign. And so he did as he had been instructed. 350 priests against one prophet. And so they gathered there on the top of Mount Carmel. And there with the people gathered about, Elijah gave that profound challenge to the people. How long will you vacillate between the two? Will you serve God or will you serve Baal? Then he challenged the priests of Baal. You take a bullock, and I'll take a bullock. You build your altar, I'll build my altar. You pray to your God, I'll pray to mine. We'll see which is the stronger. The prophets of Baal leapt at the challenge. 350, 450 against one. So they built their altar. They quartered the bullock and laid it upon it. And then they began praying and chanting from the early morning hours until noon. When noontime came and nothing had happened, Elijah began to play with them. He said, "Oh, where's your God? Is he out walking somewhere? Has he gone visiting? He may be talking, or he could be sleeping. Go wake him up." This angered the priests of Baal all the more, and as the day grew on, they became even more effusive in their outbursts of prayer, dancing, began to smash themselves with swords and spears. And when dusk came, there were the exhausted priests lying upon the ground. There was the altar, there was the raw meat. Then Elijah strode forth at the hour in which, had he been in the holy city, they would be at prayer. It was the time of eating bread and sacrifice. He gathered together 12 stones, representing the 12 stones of Israel. He built them up into an altar, and he quartered the bullock and laid it upon. He said, "Now dig a trench around the altar." And they dug a trench. He said, "Now bring buckets of water and pour upon the sacrifice." 4 times they came with buckets of water until the trenches were filled with water. Then, in a very dramatic moment, Elijah prayed, and the sky opened, lightning flashed. The meat was consumed with such heat that all the water was taken up out of the trench. With that dramatic show of power of Yahweh over Baal, then Elijah instructed the people to take the priests down into the valley and to slay them. And that they did. And then Elijah went to the top of the mountain, and there he fell down upon his knees. With his head between his knees, he began to pray. And he sent his servant to look over into the distance to see if there was any sign of rain. And on the 7th trip, the servant came back and said that the rain was coming. And Ahab went back to Samaria with the words of Elijah ringing in his ears. By the time you get there, the land will be drenched with drought. The drought was over. It would be a time for rejoicing, except for the fact that Jezebel had lost all of her priests. Baal had been defeated by Yahweh. And so, on learning what had been done, Jezebel sent word to Elijah, "What happened to my priests today will happen to you tomorrow." Elijah became fearful for that threat. He knew the power of Jezebel, the power of the throne, and so he fled once again. He fled to Beersheba. There he rested under the shade of the tree and mused over the thing that had happened. And while he was resting,
just run like a man with no reason to run, and no place to
He confronted God with his fears. I'm the only one left. There's no one to stand beside me. They're after my life. There's nothing I can do. God told him to stand before the door of the cave. And he clambered to that place and stood. And suddenly the wind blew with hurricane force outside. And he was fearful that God was going to be speaking out of that terrible wind, but there was no sound. And then there came the evidence of an earthquake, the rumbling of ground. He waited for the voice, and there was none. And then fire began to blaze forth, and he waited, and there was no voice from God. And everything stilled, the wind settled, the earthquake was over, and the fire was quenched. And then in the still small voice, God spoke. Elijah was reassured by God. He had done well. He had been God's servant. Now was the time to look for a successor, one who could carry on his work. And so God sent him down into the valley, where he would find someone on his mantle to be made. Going down through the valley, he came upon a man plowing in a field, a man with the name of Elisha. And Elijah came up, laid his mantle about the shoulders of the man with the plow. And he left his plow and followed Elijah. They lived together for a long time, Elisha learning from his master. And then the day came in which Elijah announced to Elisha that he was to stay behind, that he was on his way to Bethel. But Elisha followed. And then he wanted to leave him there as he went on his way to Jericho, but Elisha would not be left behind. He followed. And when they got to Jericho, then they started off into the Jordan Valley, and they came to the Jordan River. Again, Elisha refused to stay behind. And Elijah took the mantle from his shoulders, and he struck the water with it, and it parted, and the two walked through on dry land to the other side. And then as they walked along together, suddenly a chariot of fire swept between them. And when the chariot was gone, Elijah was gone too. Elisha stood there, and the mantle about the shoulders of Elijah had fallen on his shoulders. Elisha had left one boon for the man whom he had followed. Let me have twice the spirit of Elijah. Jews refused to believe that Elijah had died. Whenever the Jews come together for the Passover meal, there'll be a cup of wine at the table in the event that Elijah has died. In many homes, there'll be an empty chair before that goblet of wine, a place for Elijah to sit. And in the Passover observance, there comes a time in when one of the children of the family goes and flings open the door so that if Elijah passes by, he can come in and sit at the table for the Passover meal. It was with that kind of dramatic exit from history that Elijah left his impact upon the children of Israel. Before Elijah passed from the scene, he had prophesied the death of Ahab and Jezebel, prophesying that Jezebel would be eaten by dogs. And all the prophecies that he had left behind were fulfilled. And so Ahab passes from the scene into the kings that would follow until 722. Then the northern kingdom would come to an end. It was during the latter parts of this reign that the first literary prophet makes his appearance upon the scene. It is the prophet Amos from the little village of Dakota, not too far from Jerusalem. He came into the city of Bethel. Even though the capital of the northern kingdom was at Samaria, there were two temples for worship, one at Bethel and one at Dan. And he came to the sanctuary at Bethel, and there he confronted the country with their wrongs. He was preparing them for their being overwhelmed by foreign powers and passing from the scenes of world history. His book is his only contribution to Israel history. It tells of his leading the little village before, where he was a herdsman and a pincher of sycamore fruit, a man of fig. This was his means of livelihood. And when he came into Bethel and spoke in the temple there, they charged him with usurping the power of the king and the priest. And he said, I'm not a prophet, I'm not a son of a prophet, I'm only one who has a message for the people. And so he began by denouncing all of the countries outside of the northern kingdom, Moab, Ammon. The people rejoiced as he brought the censer of God upon their neighbors. Then he turned and he told of the evil of the southern kingdom, and they rejoiced all the more. And then he turned and told them of their own deeds, their own sins. And then they turned on him. Told him to go back to his own country. He came out of the southern kingdom, go back and preach to them. They didn't need him there. And so they drove him out of the city, and he went back to Troy, where he would pass so quickly out of the scene of history that he would leave behind the writing, which was the first of the literary prophets. And the contribution that he would make would be the revelation of God of righteousness. Hosea would make his appearance shortly thereafter during the time of the two kings. His revelation would be the God of God. God makes great progression during this time of history in the revelation of the prophets as he takes on the different attributes that heretofore have not been known. And so the year 722 approaches, and the time for the northern kingdom is coming to a close. Next week we'll talk about the fall of the kingdom and the remaining years of the southern kingdom. Now, I've made it a little brief this evening because, as you probably know, every free evening I have, Carlene and I have been going out and visiting in the homes to get better acquainted in the homes of all of you. I've been in some of your homes. These visits are by appointment, and so we're expecting. And last evening I had 2 appointments, and my daughter came and spent the night, just the night. And it was hard to say, well, you sit here, I'm going to be out this evening. So I called the 2 families, and they very graciously said that I could come this evening. So my first appointment was at 8 o'clock, and that's why I came just a little earlier this evening. But I do have time for just a question, too, if you have another thought.
I read that all the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom was bad, the southern kingdom of Judah, and the 9 good ones, 12 bad.
It's unbelievable how such a period of history could be marked with such corruption on the part of the kings, of the people who were living in a covenant relationship. When I was a student at the University of Tennessee, this is dating me some, because of one of the ladies who was a speaker there, Roy L. Smith. And he was a convocation speaker back when the University of Tennessee had a fall convocation every year. Remember on that occasion, Roy Smith said, there is a stronger religious influence on the campus of the University of Tennessee than any college campus I've ever been on, and that includes on the church colleges. I don't think you would say that today with no ill feeling against the UT, but I mean, it's no longer that kind of atmosphere on any college campuses. But he made that statement. But the reason for my mentioning this, he asked a question. He was talking about this period of history and of the Israelites, and he said, God was with the Israelites. How many of the battles did they lose? And the president of the university was sitting there at his side, and he popped up and he said, he won them all. And Roy Smith said, I wish that I could affirm that answer, but the fact is they lost all of them. I forget the few that remained. I have to research it, but I don't have it off the top of my head. But this was a time of losing in the life of the people. And as you know from the syllabus here, With the passing of the two kingdoms, Israel goes into servitude, never to emerge from, and we'll follow them through those years of servitude.
This golden age that you have spoken of, is that what the present day Jews long for?
Yes. Return to the days of David.
One time.
Right, and when they speak of the Messiah, they say that the throne of David will be reestablished.
Yeah.
Right, that's the Camelot for the Israelites. It was during that time that the combined kingdom was the strongest power in the Middle East, and they had defeated the enemies that ringed them about. Egypt was weak, Syria was weak. All of the outlying regions were weaker than they, and no one dared threaten them. It was a time in which David was so loved, a man with such charisma, that the people adored their king. He established the time of worship in which the Psalms were written, and the Psalm book was written. And then on the heels of that, Solomon built a magnificent temple. Solomon held the people together, even though hardships were beginning to come, because of his great wisdom and love. And it was with the passing of the two and everything that they established. The year was 922 when Camelot. Thank you so much.